Hey everybody, welcome to our YouTube SOCH 204 lecture videos coronavirus edition because society is collapsing. I mean, if Disneyland's closed, we might as well just do this all by video. How you doing? You know who I am. I'm your professor. We're gonna try doing two lectures today, and they're really important end of the term lectures, and so I think it's really I just want to do it. I want to make sure you kind of got this information. So I'm ready. I have my coffee, my Meghan Markle Prince Harry mug that I bought in London. It is now probably a valuable asset now that they've been kicked out of the royal family. We're upstairs in the vinyl attic. The attic or some vinyl. That's called vinyl, you young people. They're records. They're things that go around and around. Like these are the Beatles 50 years ago. Okay, so this first one is going to be about race and racism. And the second one we're going to do, which will be a separate video upload, will be about religion. And so we're going to tackle some big issues. And so I take notes, but feel free to save this video. All this stuff is stuff that will be on the final exam. The first one, I'm going to give you an outline of the what we're going to talk about in the first video. We just try to get through this. We're not going to spend 4 hours in front of the video. I got other things to do. The first one is divided into 5 sections. The first one is the concept of race as a social construction. And by the way, I'm going to be writing things down and I'll put them up on the screen and edit all this in. So, be almost like I'm writing on the board. First one's about race as a social construction. The second is how prejudice and discrimination intersect, and we'll do a fourfold table. The third one is about the tools of prejudice, which we will also do another fourfold table. Then we're going to do a bit about the historic roots of racism. And by the way, I wanted to say, if these topics around race are really of interest to you, I would suggest maybe you take my Social 206 class, the social problems class, because we talk a lot about this. And then the last part of this section is where I attempt to explain why America is so racially polarized and why we have so many problems near 2020, and that's talking about the intersection or the conflict between the values of assimilation and pluralism. So that's our outline. I think I just flashed it on the screen for you. So let's go ahead and do this. You ready? Ready to take good notes? This is a new thing. Okay, so we're going to start the first one talking about race as a social construction. So what is race? Right? What is race? Well, race does not exist. There you go. That's the end of it. We've been talking about things like that are absolutes as social constructions, which have a little sound effect every time I go ding ding, the concept of time and space and God. The notion that God is a white male, 65 years old, social construction. The concept of beauty, how beauty varies as a social construction. Also, we've been talking a lot in this class about how gender is a social construction, about how gender varies from place to place and time to time. Well, we can also talk about race as a social construction, that race does not really exist. This is the truth about race. This is the truth about race. You look like your biological parents, your mama and your dada, and everything after that is made up, is cultural production. There was an attempt to map the human gene. It was called the Human Genome Project. It finished the mapping of the human gene, what makes us human beings, in 2003. And one of the things they found is that the difference between so-called races, white, black, and other, is actually less than the difference within so-called races. There's more genetic diversity within white people or within black people or within Asian people. And it's really just nonsensical. If you've ever done one of those 23andMe, the chromosome.com or whatever it is, where you send your spit in and they tell you about your background, you find that people are just all over the place. In fact, the study was done in the 1980s and found that 21% of people who called themselves white, 21%, 1 in 5, had an identifiable black ancestor, not from a million years ago, but from great grandma. And so, this notion that we're all sort of mutts, but 100 years ago, anthropologists tried to tell us that there were 3 races. There was the Caucasoid race, those of us who come from the Caucasus Mountains, I guess, the Negroid race, that would be the black Africans, and the Mongoloid race from Mongolia, that's the Asians. Sorry, Asians, you're the Mongoloids. I mean, it just sort of makes no sense because you know how many people don't fit into one of those three categories. And what about biracial people? What about people like my daughter, who is both indigenous Mexican and Caucasian? What race is she? I don't know. I ask her all the time. And so this notion that race was socially constructed, but it doesn't mean it's not really important to people. The construction of God is important to people. The construction of beauty is so important to people. The construction of time and space are very important to people. Just because it's a social construction doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But I wanted to give you an example of like the ludicrousness of the social construction of race. When slavery ended in 1865, and we'll be talking a little bit about slavery, there was an attempt to be able to figure out who was white and who was black because there was a great fear of the mulatto. The mulatto was what we would now call a biracial person who somehow was passing as white but wasn't really white because they had a lot of black blood. So think Halle Berry, Barack Obama. I mean, all these people who are sort of biracial or black and white. You know, that was sort of the great fear. So in the Jim Crow days, in the days when they were really trying to institute racial segregation as the law of the land, they came up with something called the one drop plus, or the one drop plus rule. And it started in 1910 in Tennessee and then spread to a couple other states. But what this rule said is if you were 1/132nd black, 1/132nd, 1/32 black, you were legally black. And I sat down and tried to figure out what that would look like. Like you've got 2 parents and 4 great-grandparents and 8 great-grandparents and 16 great-great-grandparents and 32 great-great-great-grandparents. Here's a little video or a little image. If all those, 31 of those great-great-great-grandparents were white and one of them was black, you were legally black. And that meant you couldn't vote, you couldn't, go into some businesses. You didn't have all these sort of opportunities that white people, and it just shows you how silly it is. That race is sort of this silly social construction, but it means a lot to people, including people who are defined as minorities versus majority. So the term race is social construction, and sociologists generally acknowledge that. Generally, what we like to use instead of the term race is the term ethnicity. Ethnicity refers to a cultural group that comes from a similar culture. Remember, we talk about cultures, norms, and values, and all that stuff. And so to talk about the Irish as a cultural ethnicity, there is a certain race. I mean, having lived in Ireland for a while, you can sort of tell someone when they're Irish. That there are people who come from sort of cultural backgrounds, but often that can be many different racial characteristics. If you've ever been to Mexico City, let me tell you, Mexico City, amazing place. But we think of Mexicans as, if you're a white person, you probably have a particular image in your head of what a Mexican looks like. But you go to Mexico City, you see every shade. You see very European people, very dark-skinned indigenous people. You see Asian people, African people. All these people are all culturally Mexican. But they have different physical characteristics. So the term ethnicity is much more useful than the term race because it refers to the cultural background. So that's our rough definition of race, I guess. That it's a social construction; it doesn't exist, but it's meaningful to people. So that's point number 1. Done with that. All right, this is part 2 of the race lecture about prejudice versus discrimination. And this is kind of an interesting discussion to get into the kind of complexity of some key ideas that we often kind of interchange, the idea of prejudice and discrimination. So let's define our terms. First of all, prejudice is an attitude. It's an attitude generally about a group of people. You can be prejudiced. You can be prejudiced towards Mexican food. I love Mexican food. You can be prejudiced against the New York Yankees. You can be, there are all kinds of prejudice. We're talking about prejudice as sort of a general attitude towards a group of people that is usually negative, even though you can have positive prejudices. I love the French. Vive la France. We're talking about sort of negative attitudes, but it's an attitude. It's different from a behavior. A discrimination is a behavior that disadvantages a group of people. So you think about the classic Jim Crow discrimination based on race. You're not allowed to sit in this part of the bus, or you're not allowed to sit at this lunch counter, or you're not allowed to buy a house because you're this color skin, that type of discrimination. So we have sort of this general assumption that prejudice equals or excuse me, that attitude equals behavior. That if you believe something, then you act on it, right? You talk the talk, and you walk the walk. But one of the things that you learn is sometimes people have attitudes that they never ever act on, and some people sometimes act on attitudes that they don't actually have. And so this is an opportunity to figure out how that all plays out. And we know about this because a really famous study was done in the 1930s by this sociologist named Richard LaPierre. He was at Stanford, and he wanted to look at the kind of the intersection between prejudice, this attitude, and discrimination, this behavior. And in the first half of the 20th century, it's important to point out that there was a massive, not a massive, but a pretty strong wave of anti-Chinese sentiment in this country. After we imported a lot of Chinese labor, that labor was idle. We talked about how the laws against opium were often used to target Chinese laborers, and there was a lot of violence against the Chinese in the late 1800s and early 20th century, including in Eastern Oregon. There was something called the Chinese Cove Massacre, in which 34 miners who were Chinese were murdered and hacked to bits by white gold miners who thought they were cutting in on their territory. Portland had the largest Chinatown in the country after San Francisco, and one of the reasons Portland had such a large Chinatown is because the Chinese were being violently driven out of all the other Chinatowns on the West Coast, and there was sort of a safe haven in Portland, which is kind of cool about Portland. But it's just a time of a lot of anti-Chinese discrimination. Kind of feels like it's back at that moment if you've been to a Chinese restaurant in the last week. So what Alport wanted to do, what LaPierre wanted to do was find out how these things fit together. And so he was looking at the intersection of prejudice and discrimination. So this is going to be a fourfold table, and I'll flash this up here, but I'm going to pretend that I have a chalkboard. So remember our fourfold table, like that. And you have on the top, you would have prejudice. In this case, it is an anti-Chinese prejudice. So yes, you're prejudiced, or no, you're not prejudiced. Like that. Can you draw that? Hopefully that's not backwards. And then you have the discrimination on the side, the behavior. Yes. Why? And no, you're not discriminating. Like that. Okay, that is like a really awesome fourfold table. And so what we would expect to see are sort of the box where you're prejudiced and you discriminate. That's kind of, what we would expect, this box right here. And this is what he called the pure bigot. And I'll do a screenshot of this when it's all done so you can kind of make sure you got it down. The pure bigot. Someone who has, in this case, negative attitudes and is discriminates against the Chinese. So let me explain how this experiment works before I went any farther. This is how he did this experiment. He wanted to see how many people would act on their anti-Chinese prejudice. So he had this great idea of this experiment, very simple. He called up restaurants and hotels and said, hey, I'm traveling with some friends of mine, and we want to see if we can get a seat at your restaurant, or if we can get a room at your hotel. And then some of them, he would say, and by the way, my friends are Chinese. And some of the folks would say, yeah, we don't care. Just show up. We don't care. We're not prejudiced. We'll get you a room, or we'll get you a table. Some of the folks would say, no room at the inn. Have I heard that before? Or, yeah, we can't take you. We don't serve Chinese people in our restaurant. I mean, they would get these prejudicial attitudes. And then the second part of the experiment, he would show up with his Chinese friends to say, hey, we want to get a room at this hotel, or we want to get a couple seats at this restaurant. And some of the places did what you would expect. The pure bigots, would say, hey, we said we don't seat Chinese, and what are you doing? We're not going to give any Chinese people a seat in our restaurant. Those are the pure bigots. Those are the folks that you would expect. But he also found a couple other weird things that happened that would play out in a fourfold table. So let's sort of fill this out. Knowing that this is this idea of LaPierre's 1934 study, that first of all, you have the pure bigots here. Those are the people who would say, we said we're not going to give a room to a Chinese couple, and we're not going to give a room to a Chinese couple. So they're both being prejudiced, and they are discriminating. And then there are the people down here who aren't prejudiced or aren't discriminating. Hey, we don't care. We love the Chinese, and sure, we're going to get you a room. The term that he used for that in 1934 was liberal. Now, liberal has a kind of a different connotation now than it did in 1934. And of course, there can be liberals who are racist, and there can be conservatives who aren't racist. So that liberal term is sort of fallen out. And I'm always, since we always learn language in opposites, I'm always thinking, why don't we have an opposite word for bigot? In our current language, we learn up, down, right, left, and we're always learning things in opposite, no matter what language you're learning. What is the antonym? What is the opposite word for bigot? Do I hear anything out there? Any suggestions? I mean, there really isn't anything. Liberal really doesn't fall out. So as a placeholder, until somebody can come up with a good word for the opposite of liberal, I'm going to use the word woke. That's a good Portland word, woke. But so these are bigots and these are non-bigots. But then he found sort of these other categories. He found people who were prejudiced, who would say, no Chinese allowed. But then when they showed up at the restaurant, they got a table. Or when they showed up at the hotel, they got a room. So the people were prejudiced, but they weren't discriminating. So we had a good term for these folks. They were called the timid bigots. Timid bigots, meaning, they'll talk the talk, but they won't walk the walk. And I think you probably know some people like this. Some people will say some sort of racist things or some bigoted things, but they never actually act on it. They just like the sound of their own prejudice. So these are the timid bigots. And then this is even the more interesting ones. The people that weren't prejudiced, they would say, hey, Chinese are fine with me. But when they would show up at the restaurant or hotel, they wouldn't be served. There would be discrimination. So there would be no prejudice, but there would be discrimination. What do you think is going on there, class? That's right. Social pressure. There was some type of external pressure. Maybe the boss said, hey, if you serve these people who are Asian, it's going to cut into our, people coming to our restaurant because the bigots aren't going to come here and eat. Or the person might say, well, it's not me, it's my boss who's saying it. Somehow there's some other pressure. So we would call this the institutional bigot. Institutional, I'm writing it down, bigot. And this is an important one as well. So there's no prejudice, but there's discrimination. Think about our discussion about assets and housing and how many people of color did not get mortgage loans to buy houses, to start building equity in the American dream. Like a lot of that was done by people who said, well, it's not me, but, my boss is telling me, or I'm not allowed to do it. I might have mentioned that in 1919, the Portland Realty Board had a code of ethics. And it said, if you're a realtor and you sell a house to a non-white family in a white neighborhood, we will kick you out of the Realty Board. So I could be the most woke realtor who wants to sell houses to whoever in whatever neighborhood. But if I'm being told I'm going to lose my job unless I discriminate, I'm probably going to discriminate. So this experiment from LaPierre in 1934 was really helpful in helping us to understand the complexity of what we would now call racism. We're going to define racism in a bit, but right there. And I'll do a little screenshot of it so you can you see it? I'll just do that. I don't have to edit it. You got it? Beautiful form. Not the last fourfold table we're going to do. So that is the quick version of prejudice and discrimination. All right. Boop. All right. This is part 3. This is going pretty fast. I think what happens in the classroom is I just start telling some crazy stories. Maybe I'll tell some stories. Okay. This part about the tools of prejudice, is a little bit more involved, and this is about how we use tools of prejudice, how these things sort of manifest against different groups of people. And so here we go. The tools of prejudice. I think there's like 4 or 5 of them, something like that. The first one is, and I'll maybe have some text to make it look really good. The first one is the concept of something we've already been talking about all quarter long, is the notion of socialization. That we are socialized by our 5 socialization agents, remember? Family, school, religion, peers, and media. That we are socialized around the ideas of race and racism. In fact, here's an important term I want you to know, because you may see it again on the final. The concept of internalized white supremacy. I'm pretending the words are right there. Internalized white supremacy. That not only do we learn about race from our parents and from the TV and from, all of our friends, but we internalize a message, kind of like the way we internalize a message about gender called patriarchy. We internalize the notion that whiteness is normal and whiteness is better. And we see this, even if you don't think of yourself as a white supremacist, you've internalized this notion of white supremacy at a very early age, just by seeing white as the sort of normal standard. But think about how people of color, and we're going to come back to this topic in a little bit, are told to be white, to act white, to be acceptable, to speak white, to look white, to have your hair white and your skin white, to maybe lighten your skin or fix your eyes to look more white. I mean, Asian people have been offered this wonderful surgery that they can do on their eyes to make them look more like Caucasian people. I mean, that's a notion of internalized white supremacy. There are these incredible videos of interviews with little girls, 5 and 6-year-old girls, and you take a group of African American girls and you give them some baby dolls, and you have some white baby dolls and black baby dolls, and you say, we're going to talk about baby dolls, and you do the same thing with white girls, little white girls, white baby dolls, black baby dolls, and it's pretty powerful to see. So what these videos show you, it's based on a famous experiment. You ask the white girls, which of these baby dolls is the prettier doll? And they pick up the white doll. Which of the dolls is the uglier doll? And they pick up the black doll. Which of the dolls looks the most like you? And they pick up the white doll. Then you ask the little black girls, which of the dolls is the prettier doll? They pick up the white doll. Which of the dolls is the uglier doll? They pick up the black doll. Which of the dolls looks like you? And they pick up the black doll. I mean, it's just gut-wrenching and kind of like ethically challenged. But it shows you how early children internalize this notion of white supremacy. I was watching, here we go, here's a story. I was watching last week The Family Feud with my daughter Cozy, who's 5, and it was an African-American family and a white family. And I noticed she was not rooting for the white family, but against the black family. I said, Cozy, what's going on? She's like, I don't want them to win. Why? I don't know. And I'm like, Cozy, first of all, your mother's brown and you're biracial. I know, and you have a ton of black friends. I know, but it was clear that at 5, she was already picking up on these clues that white is better. Like, it's just kind of freaking me out that I've raised a white supremacist already at age 5. I might have to do something about that. But it was just her picking up on cues. It wasn't, she's not a white supremacist, but she is internalizing these messages about race at a very early age. So the first thing is that we just learn it. We just learn it. It's deep inside us. We learn these messages very early on. And later, if you have an opportunity to look into the issues of implicit bias, for example, it's an explanation of how that can manifest in some pretty ugly ways. So the first tool of prejudice, bing, is socialization and the notion of internalized white supremacy. The second tool of prejudice is the idea of stereotypes. Stereotypes are broad generalizations, typically about categories of people. Now, we have to be careful here because what we do in sociology is we generalize all the time. When we look at our findings and we find that, generally speaking, the more education that you make, or more education that you get, the more money that you will make. That is a generalization. Obviously, there are people with a lot of education that don't make any money, and there's people with no education that make a ton of money. Miley Cyrus comes to mind for some reason. So, but these are sort of generalizations that sort of hem people in. And if you think about all your racial and ethnic stereotypes, Muslim terrorist, black criminal, one of my favorites, lazy Mexican. Like, that was the stupidest stereotype. Do these people not know any actual Mexican people? Not lazy. Which will come up on a little bit later. But what we're doing here is something that we call selective perception. Selective perception, write that down because it's definitely on the final exam. Selective perception is how we look for things that reinforce our stereotypes. How we look for things that confirm our biases. Sometimes it's called confirmation bias. How we look for things that sort of prove that we're right about our stereotypes. And the way that we best sort of describe this is with a fourfold table. Another fourfold table. What would you do without the fourfold tables? So let me first sort of describe what we mean when we're talking about a stereotype. A stereotype is about a group of people So we start with a particular group of people, black, white, whatever, Muslim, Hindu, Southern Baptist. Pick your favorite group of people. A group of people that have a particular attribute. Mexicans, lazy. I don't know where that comes from. So it's about sort of these two things, the group of people and the attribute. So let's do the fourfold table, shall we? Okay, here we go, drawing fourfold table, starting out again with our blank fourfold table. So we have the group. Yes, you're a member of the group. No, you're not. Boop, boop, boop. And then we have the attribute. Yes, you have the attribute, and no, you don't. So let me tell you how this works. This is selective perception. And by the way, let me tell you, I was an intro sociology student my freshman year in college. I was pre-med, took a sociology class because I was bored. And some of the stuff, was really mind-blowing. But really, this concept of selective perception is the one thing that stuck with me more than anything in that first sociology class I ever had. This is the thing that I really still use now, and I talk about it because, dear students, it's something we all do. It's something that everybody does. So we're gonna use this to explain some racial stereotypes. Let's say Muslim terrorist or black criminal, whatever. But I want to start with a stereotype that I've been wrestling with, especially since I moved to the Pacific Northwest. And I have to be honest about it, and this is going to be on YouTube, so God, everybody's going to find out about it. Here's my stereotype. And I understand it's a stereotype, but I still hold on to it. People from the state of Washington cannot drive. They can't drive. What's wrong with people from the state of Washington? This is my stereotype. It's about a group of people, Washingtonians, and an attribute. Bad frickin' drivers. Hey, YouTube. So what that means is when we find someone that fits the stereotype, so this is going to be this category here. Yes, you're in the group. So this time it's Washington, and the attribute is bad driving. I'll just put BD. When we find someone here, yes, they're a member of the group, we freaking notice them. So, for example, if I'm driving the PCC and there's somebody stopped at a red light and they don't go when the light turns green because they're on their phone and they have Washington license plates, proof of my theory. God damn them. If I see somebody blast through a red light and they have Washington plates, proving my theory. If I see somebody driving up on a sidewalk and runs over a little dog and they've got Washington plates, they have proven my theory. I am going to notice that. I'm going to notice that because that reinforces my stereotype. I'm also then going to notice all the non-Washington, meaning Oregon, good drivers. Look at all those people with Oregon plates driving just fine. Why can't these people be more like them? They're good drivers. But here's something else that happens because we have a fourfold table. That means we've got two other things to fill up. Is that the people that belong to that group that don't fit the stereotype, I'm going to ignore them. So if I'm driving, and there's lots of Washington plates when I drive, and most of them are doing absolutely nothing wrong. They're on the road, just doing fine. I don't pay any attention. I don't even see them. It's like they're invisible because they don't reinforce the stereotype. So my brain isn't looking for them to reinforce the stereotype. But here's the thing that's really interesting. If I see someone who's not in that group, for example, somebody from Oregon, they're somebody from Oregon, and they're a bad driver, what do I do then? I make an excuse. Oh, they're probably late to work, or they had a bad childhood, or maybe they're high. It's not because they're from Oregon that they're bad drivers. So the attribute isn't about the group, it's about the individual. So we go from macro over here, all Washington drivers are bad. There's something in the water in Washington, or they're all on meth, or they're in Oregon and they're freaking out because there's no sales tax. There's something wrong with those people. When somebody from Oregon does the exact same thing, it's not about the group that they belong to. It's something about them as an individual. It gets much more micro. Does that make sense? Do you do it? I do it all the time. I probably did it today. So if we think about a stereotype like Muslim terrorist, when somebody pops up on the news who, is trying to blow something up and their name is Muhammad, we're going to be like, well, see, proof. And then we're like, look at all the non-Muslims that aren't blowing things up. And then when we, think about the 99.999% of Muslims that aren't blowing anything up or fighting terrorism or the victims of terrorism, we don't even see them. They're completely invisible to us. We ignore them. And when someone who's not a Muslim gets busted for terrorism, some white guy, for example, we're like, oh, they're just crazy. It's not because they're white. I got in trouble. I was on some national news show, and I used the word Christian terrorist to talk about some white supremacists who belong to a sort of Christian belief. And I got so much blowback from it because it's so easy to say Muslim terrorist, even though almost all Muslims aren't engaged in any terrorism. But this guy who was a Christian terrorist, it's because he's crazy. And they're like, well, all Christians aren't terrorists. I'm like, oh, I know. Well, 99.9% of Christians are not terrorists, but this guy was a Christian terrorist. So this selective perception is really, really important. So I'm going to make sure that you know this, and I'll put up another version of this. Maybe as a screenshot or something so you can see that. So that's the second one. So first is first is socialization, second is stereotypes, third is projection. What's projection? Projection is just projecting your guilt onto other people, onto other groups of people, the things that you feel bad about. So for example, going back to the stereotype of the lazy Mexican, I lived with a Mexican. I suggest everybody live with a Mexican. It's very handy because they work their asses off and do amazing work and are not lazy. Where's that stereotype come from? In fact, I've been sitting around watching my particular person who happens to be Mexican. And then I realized I'm the lazy one. I'm the lazy one. I'm the one that wants to sleep in, and I'm the one that would like to have only one job. I'm projecting my guilt about being lazy onto another group of people. That's how projection works, where you're projecting sort of the way you feel bad about yourself onto other groups of people. And let me give you sort of the classic example of how projection has been used. The stereotype of the black rapist, of the black male rapist raping white women. It's been around for a while. If you ever get a chance to see Birth of a Nation, the classic 1915 epic silent film, based on a story called The Klansman. I mean, it's incredibly racist, and it's all about black men raping white women. And this is what, brought the Klan out, because there was this fear of black men raping white women. And that stereotype has been around for a long, long time. We just finished passing the anti-lynching bill. It was based on a kid in Mississippi, 60 years ago, who was lynched, a black kid, for just whistling at a white woman. So this kid named Emmett Till. I mean, it's that stereotype has been so powerful for over 100 years. But where did it come from? There's this great historian named Howard Zinn who did a little bit of research about this. And he figured if there is a real strong fear of black men raping white women, it must have been really hot during the slave days, because there were a lot of black men working on these plantations and a lot of white women who were living there who were often unprotected, especially during the Civil War when all the men went to fight in Gettysburg. They must have been terrified that their unprotected white women were going to be raped by these savagely sexual black men. And so Howard Zinn went back and studied all the press and the literature, the fiction and the nonfiction. Nothing about black men raping white women until the end of the Civil War. Then all of a sudden this story starts to percolate about black men raping white women. And when he went to look at it, he's like, let's think about this. Before this all happened, where was the rape? Where was the interracial rape in the slavery days? Right? It was the rape of slave women by white men. I mean, this was legendary how many women were sexually assaulted by their slave masters. It's the reason there are so many complexions among African Americans, because massa was in the house, because there was just so much miscegenation and sexual assault and rape by white men of black women. So when slavery ends, then the projection starts. I'm not the rapist. They're the rapist. We weren't raping their women, they were raping our women. It was a way of flipping the guilt to make the other people feel bad. So projection is that notion of projecting your guilt. A modern version of this is when you see anti-gay politicians, all of a sudden, turns out they have a little secret that they don't tell. These people come out against gay marriage and gay rights and, are super conservative and beating the Bible, and all of a sudden it turns out they're gay. They're projecting their guilt for themselves onto other people. So projection, that is whatever that is, number 3. The next one is scapegoating. Scapegoating is the idea, very similar, that you are taking complex problems and blaming them on individuals. And this actually has an origin close to the name. It's an old Hebrew notion of scapegoating, where you take the sins of the tribe, the things that you've done bad all year, you put it on a goat. You have a little ritual. This goat takes our sins, and you send the goat out into the wilderness to be eaten by a lion or something. And that way you can start the year fresh. So scapegoating actually has this sort of notion of putting the goat on the sins on a goat and letting it escape. Well, there is a sort of very famous version of scapegoating. It came from this little guy named Hitler, Adolf Hitler. Funny little mustache, maybe you heard of him. Germany lost the First World War, the war to end all wars, because they didn't know there was going to be a sequel. And they were very confused, and the reason they lost was very complex, right? It had to do with the end of empires and the global economy. Things were really shifting in the world, especially once America got involved. And so there was a lot of Germans who were like, what the hell happened? How did we were the mighty Germans and we lost this war? So Hitler and his little band of people said, yeah, instead of giving a very complex answer to a complex problem, I'll tell you why we lost the war. It was the Jews. Let's just blame the Jews. The Jews run the banks, and the Jews run the media, capitalism and all that stuff. And so it became a very simple way to take all the sins that led to the fall of Germany in the early 1920s and put it on one group of people, the Jews, which led to the Holocaust, because the scapegoating of the Jews, which there's a long history of, made a lot more sense. And a similar version of that now is our dear president, our dear leader, blaming all our economic problems on the Mexicans, who are sending their murderers and rapists, and it's all the Mexicans. And the economy is a very complex issue, but if you can have one simple group of people to simplify it, that's going to fuel prejudice. So that's scapegoating. That's another one. So that's another term. And then another one is one that we've already talked about, which is ethnocentrism. So you'll remember, class, ethnocentrism. Remember, what is ethnocentrism? It's when we use the standards of our culture to judge another culture. Remember that discussion? So they eat weird food, they have a weird religion, they drive on the wrong side of the street, they kiss when they meet. Sorry, I don't think they can do that anymore. That sort of ethnocentrism, the way we talked about how we described the Native Americans as savages and uncivilized. In fact, they were hardly uncivilized. In many ways, they were more civilized than the white people were. But we sort of judge them. So ethnocentrism, I could spend too much time on that because we've already talked about it. But the last one is ignorance. And ignorance, we use ignorance as a pejorative. Hey, you're so ignorant, you're so stupid. But we're all ignorant. We're all ignorant. I was going to do this on Zoom, but I'm too dumb to figure out how to work Zoom to do this, so I went by my old standby of YouTube. How many languages do you not know? How many great musical factoids or sports factoids do you not know? We're all kind of dumb. There's a lot more that you don't know than you do know, no matter how smart you are. And so there's a lot of ignorance around people who are different from us. When growing up in the South, and one of the things that white people would say is, well, when we grew up, I'm going to put my southern accent on. I swear this is just coffee. Well, we grew up, there was only white people there. We couldn't be racist because there was only white people. Darn it, we didn't have anybody to be racist to. Well, that's where the racism comes in, because you don't know any actual people of color, and therefore what fills in the void is stereotypes and misinformation and bad stuff from your crazy uncle. And, there is this sort of ignorance that fits in. I always tell the story of my grandmother in Chattanooga, Tennessee, right after 9/11 in 2001. I was visiting her, and she said some pretty horribly ignorant things about Islam that were just wrong. Even I, as a WASP kid from the South, knew were wrong. I was like, Grandma, that's not right. That's not right. So I sent her this book called Islam for Beginners. It's around here somewhere. Maybe I could find it. And she read it. She read the whole thing, and she called me up and she said, Randy, I finished reading that book and I learned so much. I'm like, what did you learn? Because for me, always trying to keep straight the sort of schism in Islam between the Shiite and the Sunni tribes. That one's always sort of, I always have to remind myself of that. She said, no, it was that Muslims worship the same God as I do. I was like, yeah, Grandma, Allah is just the Arabic word for God. It's the same story. Jesus is in the Quran. It's all part of the same family tree. It's all the same faith. And she said, yeah, I can't believe that I thought it was such a different religion. And I'm like, well, Grandma, I'm sure in Chattanooga there's a Muslim community. Why don't you go meet with them? Because you have a similar faith tradition. And so my little grandma, who's about this big, by the time she was in her 90s, went and knocked on the door of the local mosque in Chattanooga. Hello? Are there any Muslims here? And they took her in and gave her a tour of the mosque, and they started a kind of interfaith fellowship with her Presbyterian church, just because she was so ignorant that she let all the crap about Sharia law and all the stuff. She was watching a lot of Fox News, so a lot of that stuff just got piped in. And once she actually started meeting some people and having fellowship with some Muslim folks, a lot of that ignorance went away, which is good news, because that means we can fix it, right? We can fix it with knowledge. We can fix it with education. And the good news is that we can fix all of these things: socialization, stereotypes, projection, scapegoating, ethnocentrism, I had to peek, and ignorance. We can fix all those things. That's good news. Okay, that's the end of that point. Told you it was a bunch. Okay. What is the historic root of racism? Oh, God, this is a big question. Because a lot of people say, oh, we've always had, anytime anybody says since the beginning of time, they're wrong. We've already talked about that with regards to patriarchy, the notion that men always sort of had the power. It's just a lot of BS, especially when you look at hunting and gathering societies and how partnership they are in. This is the whole Eisler point. So this notion that we've always had racism, yeah, people have been judging people that were different from them, but we haven't had sort of this real version of racism. And this real version of racism, we have to define what it is so we can get to the beginning point. We're going to give you a birth date of modern racism that we should all do the opposite of celebrating. So we're defining racism as a type of prejudice, right? Prejudice, right? A group of attitude toward a group of people. Prejudice is a broad category. Racism is kind of a subcategory of prejudice. And racism is a prejudice that views a group of people as inferior, as somehow less than. So you could be prejudiced. I don't like, the French because they're so stinky. But it's different to say the French are inferior beings, that they are somehow less than. So the theme around this part of our discussion is the concept of dehumanization. The idea that dehumanization is what makes racism different from prejudice. So let me tell you how this starts. And this has a lot to do with the idea of slavery. And people will say, well, we've always had slavery. Well, yes and no. I mean, the slavery has changed over the years. Slavery, for a long time, for most of our human history and most around the world, has been about capturing other people and enslaving them. You go to battle with the tribe across the hill, and if you beat them, you get their stuff, and you get some of their people to do your dirty work. The Romans were famous for enslaving people, like the Gauls, who are the French. The Native American tribes here in this region, the Qualia, the ones of Washington County, Qualia. I'm sorry. I'll put it on the bottom of the screen because I'll Google it when I edit this together. Those Indians enslaved, they were slaves in this part of Oregon. They would capture them and they would make them do their laundry, essentially, and sometimes they would make them go to war against other tribes. So there were slaves here, and African tribes would enslave each other. So this notion of fighting and then we win and we enslave you, a little bit different. We're talking about something a little bit different. So when the global sea of trade starts in the 1400s, when we really start the age of exploration, and countries start going out and realizing there was a lot of stuff out there to bring in. We're talking about European countries here. There was there was a need for cheap labor, and so you could enslave people, but you had to go to war against them to enslave them. That's kind of expensive. War is expensive even in those days, and they hadn't invented drones yet, so it was like a lot of fighting and climbing and wrestling and noogies. This is when the Catholic Church, so remember our discussion about how the Catholic Church sort of ruled all of Europe until the Enlightenment. There's a story in Christianity that makes it sort of hard to justify enslaving people just to enslave them. And this is the story of Moses. I'm assuming some of you know who Moses was. Apocryphal story in the Christian Old Testament and in Judaism. And what is Moses most famous for? Well, Moses is famous for rain of blood, right? Turning his staff into a serpent, bread falling from the sky, manna from heaven, which I always thought would be a really good, if I was really hungry, I wish I was like Moses and could just make like a cheese sandwich fall from the sky. Can't do that. There was a lot of magic in those days. The thing that he is most famous for, Moses, also parting the Red Sea, but what was he doing when he was parting the Red Sea? He was freeing the slaves of Israel from bondage in Egypt. The Pharaoh had enslaved the Hebrews to build all these amazing temples and pyramids and stuff like that. So there was this slavery then. They were slaves just because they were Jews, just because they were Hebrews. And so that story makes it really hard to enslave other people. If the Europeans in the 1400s would enslave other people just to enslave them, wouldn't that make them the Pharaoh? And then it would make the people they were enslaving the new Hebrews, and then some new Moses would be like, "Let my people go, Pope." So you would be the ultimate hypocrite to enslave other people, to be a Christian and enslave other people, right? So this is the starting point. There was this sort of conundrum. It was too expensive to get slaves by going to war for them, and you couldn't just enslave them because then you're the Pharaoh, and that doesn't fly. So there was this little conundrum, and these in the 1400s, the Pope at the time, this is 1452, I'll give you the date here, June 18th, 1452. The Pope was named Nicholas V, Nick 5, as I like to call him. Hey, Nick 5, what's up, my dog? These Portuguese traders went to Pope Nicholas V and said, "We really need cheap labor. We're bringing in all the stuff from around. We hadn't even gotten to the United States, the Americas yet. 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. We're in 1452. But there's all this need for cheap labor, and these Portuguese traders said, "Can you do us a solid, man? We need to find a way that we can get cheap labor, because we just can't keep fighting all these people and winning some and losing some and maybe getting some slaves and not. What can you do?" So the Pope had his scholars sit around, or Pope Fire or whatever it was in the Vatican in Rome, and they came up with an idea. Here's the idea. This is the Pope speaking, this isn't Randy Blazak speaking. We are going to determine or redefine the nations of Africa, the continent of Africa, as being full of non-people. We're going to reclassify the massive population of the continent of Africa as being not people. They are soulless beasts of the field. This was the language that was used by the Pope, that they are animals. They have no souls, which is funny to think about people from Africa having no souls. I'm like, have you ever heard an Usher record? I won't sing. Aretha Franklin, perhaps. R-E-S-P-E-C-T. Like that these people had no soul. They weren't animals. And so in this date, June 18th, 1452, he sent out this decree. It's called the Dum Dervasis, this sort of papal decree that says, as of this point, the people of Africa are now in perpetual servitude because they are not fully people. They are animals. And of course, we enslave animals all the time, right? We enslave horses and cows and pigs to do all the stuff that we want horses and cows and pigs to do, and nobody feels bad about it. So if the people of Africa were no longer people, have at it. Go get them. They aren't people. You can bring them to your world and dress them in your clothes and teach them your religion, but they'll never fully be people. And so this singular act by the Catholic Church in 1452 damned the people of Africa to 400 years of slavery and starts the slave trade that is incredibly brutal. So this is really important. This is such an important point. This is one of the reasons I wanted to get to this conversation, is this is based on a concept of dehumanization. The people of Africa were dehumanized by the slave trade. They were made less than human, and therefore they could be raped, they could be tortured, they could be murdered, their children could be taken away from them, they could be killed just because you needed your bodies and you didn't need it anymore. I mean, you could do anything you wanted to because these were no longer human beings. And that starts this incredibly horrific diaspora. I want you to know that term. It's in your Giddens textbook. Diaspora. This diaspora of the African people out of their homelands being stolen. Sometimes one tribe would be used against another tribe. We tell tribe A, hey, tribe A, we won't enslave you if you help us capture tribe B. So tribe A would go help and capture tribe B, and then they'd go to tribe C. Hey, tribe C, we won't enslave you if you go help us capture tribe A. And tribe A would be like, wait a second, doesn't matter. And so this incredibly abusive, this disgusting slave trade of dehumanization for 400 years became the norm, this dehumanization. And the dehumanization worked, right? So why not dehumanize the Irish? The Irish are dogs. Why not we dehumanize gay people? They're faggots. They're not people. Why do you dehumanize women? They're bitches. They're not people. I mean, this dehumanization was so effective that it became a tool of oppressing other people by dehumanizing. We do it in times of war. You know, when you're going to war in the Middle East, it's against jihadis and ragheads and hajis. They aren't people with real feelings and lives, and they're things. And so the dehumanization of the slave trade doesn't end in 1865, right? The Civil War ends in 1865. That officially ends. Like 1808 is the end of the importation of slaves from Africa officially. 1865 is the end of the Civil War. And it's all good in the hood, right? Everything's fine after that. Even Stephen, even Plainfield. No, of course it continues. And the important part of this notion of dehumanization is white people believe it, but everybody else believes it, including black people. It's called the internalization of this negative label of inferiority. That you internalize it. Once a slave, always a slave. And I'll give you a couple examples of how this thing works. We call this the legacy of slavery, that in 2020, we are still dealing with this label of inferiority. Not just white people who have internalized white supremacy, but this includes black people also who have, been taught to internalize this label of inferiority. So 2 examples that I like to use. One is the Confederate battle flag. Let's flash it up right there. The Confederate battle flag. Where I come from, you see it all over the place, right? That has become the symbol of the enslavement of black people. I was doing a high school talk out at Hood River Valley High School. I'll go ahead and mention it, I don't mind. And I, talking to kids about racism and the work that I do, and I noticed there were all these Confederate flags all over the school. They were on white kids' lockers and their backpacks, and I was like, yo, what's up with the Confederate battle? Oregon was not in the Confederacy. What's up with that? So this young white boy, out of the mouth of babes, says, well, the Mexicans have their flag. We want ours. And I was like, isn't that the flag of the United States of America? Why are you picking a flag that you will see at a Klan rally? Another little story. So I used to manage this rock band, Driving and Crying. We used to travel the country rocking, and it was pretty cool. They're coming to town, August 16th or 16th, I think, at Dante's. Come, I'll be singing. We were in some small southern town somewhere, Arkansas or Alabama or somewhere, some truck stop, and there was this white guy with a red T-shirt on and a Confederate battle flag, and it said, "The South will rise again." We'll call him Bubba. And I was like, "Hey man, what's up?" I have this little game I like to play called Asshole with a Cause. So I was like, "Hey Bubba, what's up, man?" And he's like, "Oh God, these long hair rock and roll people." I said, "Hey, I gotta ask you a question. I'm from Stone Mountain, and whenever I say I'm from Stone Mountain, white supremacists immediately give me a pass because as I said on day one, that's the birthplace of the Ku Klux Klan. So if I say I'm from Stone Mountain, like white supremacists are like, "Oh, you're one of us." I said, "Can I ask you about that shirt? I gotta ask you what it means. The South will rise again." And then before he could answer it, I said, "The South has risen economically. The jobs all moved down south from the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt. So economically it rose. It's risen politically. You can't win the White House without winning the South. Just ask Bernie Sanders about that one. You really need to carry the southern states. It's risen culturally, whether it's country music or the dirty, dirty South hip hop, southern literature. I mean, the South rose." And he said, "Well, you know what I'm talking about." I'm like, no, please tell me. I need to hear it from your beautiful white lips. What this means. You know what I'm talking about. I'm like, what? He said, the old ways. The old ways. I'm like, what? Old ways like the 1960s old ways? He's like, no, you know what I mean. because there's a secret language that white people can speak to each other about race. And I said, you mean like plantations? He's like, nah, yeah, that, you know what I'm talking about. That's right. I said, you mean like slavery? That's what I'm talking about. And he was straight up ready to go back and reclaim some slaves. So that Confederate battle flag is in people's minds as a notion that we did it before and we're going to do it again. The South is going to rise again. And so that's an example of the legacy of slavery. Another example, though, is in our last names, what we call ourselves. My name is Randy Blazak. My great-grandfather was Mikhail Blazak. So my name is Czech. My excuse me, Corona. My name connects me to my Czech ideology, or my Czech identity, my ethnic heritage. My wife's name is Barrios. She's from Mexico. Our child is Czech and Mex, a Czech Mex child. If your name is O'Malley, or your name is Smith, or your name is Watson, or your name is Weinstein, or your name is whatever, your last name is a way of connecting you to your ethnic identity. We hear a lot about this, and St. Patrick's is coming up. That, if you've got an Irish name, you like get a free drink, and then everybody's like, "Got any Irish in you? Would you like a little more Irish in you?" That's St. Patrick's joke. But if you're an African American, especially if you're an African American whose family history goes back to the days of slavery, what is your last name? What is your actual last name? You don't know, right? If your name is Washington or Jackson or Lincoln, that's not your African name. I mean, what happened when slaves were freed in 1865 is they either took the name of their owner or the name of a famous white person, like Lincoln, right? That's why there's so many Lincolns and Jacksons and Washingtons, because those were names of famous people, and you got to name yourself. So the great civil rights leader, Malcolm X, his name is Malcolm Little. His name that he was born to was Malcolm Little. And then he realized that's not his true name. That's his slave name. So when he says his name is born in bondage. And so that's why he changed his name to Malcolm X, X being the unknown, because he doesn't know what his name is. His name has been stolen from him by the brutality of slavery. And so that's why, in the 1960s, we go from colored to Negro to black to African American. Suddenly there was a kind of cultural decision made to say, hey, we have a history that goes back before slavery, when we were kings. We have this long history as black people that goes way beyond the 19th century enslavement, and we need to reconnect that. There was a whole wave of African Americans who have given their kids vaguely African sounding names because it sounds more authentic than Brad Jackson. No, you want to give yourself a more African sounding name to say, hey, there is a part of me that predates slavery. But just having to do that and not having your ethnic identity in your name is another reminder of the legacy of slavery, of another reminder of that label of inferiority. So I hope that makes sense to people, because that's sort of a really powerful piece of this that I wanted to make sure that people got. And if you ever get a chance to watch the movie Roots, or the TV series Roots, or read the book that Alex Haley wrote, Roots, it's all about going back and reconnecting with your family history before the enslavement kicked in. That there was this history before. It was very powerful when it aired on TV in 1977. It's almost amazing that this show aired on network TV on prime time, because it's pretty brutal. It's pretty brutal. But I would really recommend, if you get a chance, to watch the slave, it's not a documentary, the slave miniseries Roots, or 12 Years a Slave is another great movie. I mean, there's some good movies that get at this, but Roots is really the one. It's all about the legacy of slavery. Geez, I hope I can edit all this together tonight. I'm going to be up late tonight. Okay, this last piece is the big one. I think I might even draw something for this one. It's so big. It's about how we explain why the United States has such a racial problem. And it goes back to our discussion about values. And remember, we're talking about values, I think week 3 maybe. The values are sort of shared concepts of what is good or desirable. We value money, we value privacy, we value the family, we value, fun. This is about how sometimes these values can be in conflict with each other. And so we're going to talk about 2 values. The first value, and I asked you to kind of read this in Giddens for the midterm, because I told you we'd be coming back to it. Well, here we are coming back to it right now. The first value is assimilation. Assimilation. So if you remember from your reading, assimilation is what we would call the melting pot value. America is a melting pot. Melting pot. And each of these values has sort of a positive part, but then kind of a dark part. So the positive part of assimilation is, we are a whole bunch of different people who created one common culture. The motto of the United States, does anybody know? It is not "In God We Trust." Good try. It is "E pluribus unum," which is Latin for "out of many, one." The idea that we come from all these different cultures all around the world and create one beautiful common culture that is the American. We roughly all speak the same language to different degrees. I'm still learning my English. We have sort of similar holiday structures. Hey, 4th of July, Christmas is just around the corner. And we have sort of this common way of life, including hamburgers and apple pie and peach melbas, I don't know, whatever you drink with your hamburgers and your apple pie. And so we've created this beautiful, we've melted together into this common culture. That's the good part. We all can make some sort of references. And if I say, well, about Friends, the TV show Friends, even if you haven't seen it, the sort of the common frame of reference, right? That symbolic interaction, this notion of shared understanding. The dark side, though. The dark side is assimilating to what? Assimilating to what? So the very first acronym we used when we started this class way back when, in the days before the coronavirus, is the term WASP. Remember that term? White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, WASP. That is the dominant cultural standard of the United States. So if you're going to assimilate, that's what you're going to assimilate to. You're going to become more like a WASP. And so that might mean your culture changes. I'm going to eat what WASPs eat, so I'm going to leave the ethnic food of my family behind and eat apple pie and hamburgers because that's what you eat. I might change my religion. My family was Catholic. I come from a long line of Catholics. My great-grandfather was in the seminary in Prague. He got kicked out because he liked to drink a little bit. Went to America because he heard they liked to drink a little bit. And then we became Presbyterian. We became Protestants because that was the dominant religion. And so you change that. Some people will change the way they look. They will lighten their skin to look whiter. They will straighten their hair to look whiter. They will change the way they hold their body to be more like Brad. This is my white person. And they will give up the things that make them unique to assimilate to the larger culture. You're giving something up to assimilate. I once saw Abbie Hoffman, the great 60s radical, speak, and he said, if America is a melting pot, a lot of people are getting burned. So there you go. That's the idea. The dark side of assimilation is everybody's got to be more like the WASP. Some people can do it successfully because, my family was sort of white European. So all they had to do is go from being Catholic to being Protestant and start speaking English, and they were fine. Some people can try, but if they're Asian or Latino or African origin, there's only so far that you can go. There's a famous quote from Malcolm X, who had a lot to say about assimilation. And I'm going to use the language from Malcolm X. He said, what does a white man call a black man with a PhD? It's not a riddle. What does a white man call a black man with a PhD? And then his answer would be a nigger. That no matter how much he assimilates into white society, he's still black, which is a very powerful statement from Malcolm X. So you have that piece of it, assimilation. We are a melting pot culture. We love to assimilate. We want everybody to share the same holidays and all join into the big gumbo that is America. But the other value, which is in direct contrast to this, that we also hold dear, is the value of pluralism. Pluralism, like plural, more than one. Pluralism. And pluralism is the diversity value. We love diversity. I mean, think about how much we love diversity. Think about all the great food, because we are so varied, that there is all kinds of... I really hope people are going out and eating at Asian restaurants when all this hysteria is happening, whether it's Chinese or Vietnamese or Thai or whatever, because A, it's delicious, and B, those people need some money right now. Let's support our community. But, incredible variety of food. Think about how music is so so explosive because of the mixture of all types of musical styles that come and weave in and weave out. Despacito. There is just like this incredible diversity that happens that makes our lives worth living. That there's this incredible patchwork, and it's really exciting. So we love it. We love our diversity. We love our pluralism. But the dark side of that is to maintain that differentness, that diversity, you got to put some walls up. You got to do a little bit of segregating. Let's say you have a beautiful Chinatown. Speaking of Chinatowns, you have a Chinatown and you want to preserve that Chinatown. You go to San Francisco, right? You want to go to Chinatown. It's amazing. Take a walk down Grant. It's like, you're on the other side of the planet. If I want to maintain that Chinatown, I got to say, no Chinese are allowed to live here. I got to keep Chinatown China. I want to maintain the things that are here. I went to a Native American wedding out in Warm Springs, and it was two members of different tribes. One was Wasco and one was Umatilla, I think, tribes. And they were very excited that they were marrying two Native people marrying, because their kids would also be Native. They wouldn't assimilate because there's a long history of trying to make Native people assimilate. They would force these kids into boarding schools, cut off the boys' hair, and make them speak the King's English. I mean, there was really a forced assimilation. So to have two Native Americans marry each other meant that they would be able to preserve the pluralism, but their kids would assimilate a little bit because their kids would be only half Wasco and half Umatilla. When I was doing my graduate work in Prague, going back to the old country, my grandmother said, "Randy, I want you to bring something back from Prague. I want you to bring something back from Czech for me." I'm like, "Okay, Grandma, what do you?" Because they're really famous for their Bohemian glass. They started crystal. So I'm like, "Oh God, Grandma's going to want me to lug some glass all the way back across the planet." She said, "No, Randy, I want you to bring back a wife. There is not enough Czech blood in our family. My mom was English, sort of an English person, so I'm only really half Czech." She's like, "We need more Czech blood in the family. Go bring back a wife." I'm like, "Okay, Grandma, I'll do my best," which I did. I tried, but sorry, Grandma, I married a Mexican. There you go. So there is this inherent tension for pluralism that you need some division. And that means that these two values, assimilation and pluralism, are always bumping up against each other. So if you assimilate, you undo the pluralism. If you assimilate, if you become more and more American, you become less and less diverse. And to maintain the diversity, the pluralism, means you have to resist the assimilation. This is why we're so screwed up, because we have these two values. I'm hoping this makes sense. They're really exact opposites of each other, that we want to do both at the same time. Countries like Canada say, we want to do pluralism. We want to have as much diversity as possible. And if we have to put up some boundaries, we'll do it. But here, we want everybody to drop the hyphen and just be American. Although tell that to the Irish on St. Patrick's Day. They practice pluralism on that day. And the best way to sort of describe this tension, this is sort of the last piece of this section, is about how we talk about generations of immigrants. So when people come to this country, from wherever, pick your favorite place, coming from Ethiopia or Cuba or Zanzibar, when people come to a new country, they find people like them and hang out. So the sort of first wave of immigrants come in what we would call in an enclave. They find people just like them. And the same is true, by the way, if you go overseas and want to find Americans. Americans, I've been in Europe. I spent a lot of time in Europe, and somebody will be speaking English with an American accent. Immediately, everybody's like hanging out together, even though they would never talk to each other in the United States, because they're in another country and they know they're from the same place. I think this is probably happening in Europe right now with Trump's latest crazy travel ban. All the Americans are like, "What's going on? What's going on? What's going on?" So when people come to this country, they find an enclave of people like them. So let's say Cuba. Let's say Cuba, for example. You're coming from Cuba. You're going to find other Cubans, and that's the first place you're going to go. You're going to go to Miami, and Miami has a great ethnic enclave called Little Havana. You get the best Cuban food. It's actually better than it is in Cuba. I've been to both Miami and the real Havana. Cuban food is better in Miami than Havana. They hang out together. They all speak the same language. They have the same customs. They can help each other get adjusted. But those people then have babies. And those are the first generation Americans. And those kids still speak the same language and eat that food because they get it at home. But they're speaking a lot more English, right? And they're starting to sample some of the mainstream cuisine. So what they're doing is they are assimilating. The first generation is practicing pluralism. They're just hanging out with their own. But their kids are starting to assimilate. And then their kids, the second generation, assimilate even more. right? They might not even know the old language. Maybe they know a little bit so they can talk to their grandma and grandpa, their abuelos who are here, but they're speaking a lot more of the main language and much more acculturated or assimilated. I know lots of Mexican Americans who don't speak any Spanish. They don't speak any Spanish. What? Yes, it's possible. I know these people because they've assimilated into the American culture. And then the third generation, and this is something the sociologists have really found really interesting. Around the third generation, that you've assimilated so much, that's that ring right there, that you start to become part of the mainstream culture. You've lost the thing that made you unique. You've lost the pluralism. You've lost the diversity, and there's a sense of loss. Like, well, what am I? I'm just a mutt. And so what we find, or what sociologists find, is that third generation people try to go back and reclaim some of their ethnic identity. It's funny because I'm third generation Czech. This is my great grandfather, Michael. This is my grandfather, Emil Blazak. My father, Robert Blazak. This is me. And I was the one who's like, wait a second, I've really assimilated into American culture so much, I've lost the thing that made me unique. I'm going to start going back to the old country and discovering some of the wonderful Czech culture. It's a great place. If you've ever been in Prague, oh, the Paris of the East, let me tell you, great music, great, and the food kind of sucks, but pretty amazing, amazing literature. Like, there is this tension of going back. So I imagine there are people in this room that are somewhere on this model of, either you just got here and are in the enclave, or you're starting to assimilate out. And I know a lot of people at PCC are first generation immigrants, right? Their parents don't speak English as well as they do. And your kids will probably speak even less of your native language than you do. And then their kids will be like, whoa, what happened to us? Let's go back and discover the old ways. We need chilaquiles and piñatas. So let's go back to the old ways. And so this tension right here explains so much of what's happening in terms of American racial and ethnic identity, this tension between assimilation and pluralism. So it would make a really excellent question on an essay test. Why is America messed up? This tension between these two values, especially when we look at how it plays out across the generation of immigrants in America. Hope you can see that. Okay, y'all. That's the end of Lecture 1, The Race and Racism. I'm going to edit all those little pieces together, maybe fly in a few things, and we'll be back shortly with Part 2, our very quick discussion on religion. All right, see you in a second.